Hi guys, today we will start with the story, You Life as a Rich Medieval Lord. Morning of Lord Airwood dawn. Slowly crept into the stone chambers of Airwood Castle. Through the narrow arrow slits, a cold golden light stretched across the walls, sliding over massive oak beams, ancestral tapestries, and the gleam of weapons and shields that adorned the corridors. Somewhere below, in the courtyard, life was already stirring. Doors slammed, cows shuffled toward pasture, and the gates of the stables opened with a dull clatter. Lord Richard Airwood was already awake. Accustomed to early mornings, he required no bell nor servant to begin his day. Broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with a stern brow and a heavy gaze, he seemed as much a part of the stone walls as the castle itself. His body was strong, his mind sharper still, like the blade of the sword that hung on the wall since his father fell at the Battle of Trinbury. Each morning began the same, with a silent inspection of his domain. Below the castle sprawled his lands, damp meadows, smoking village chimneys, and well-tended fields, glistening with dew. All of it belonged to him, by right of blood, steel, and fear. His rule here was absolute. This day the castle prepared for an important occasion, tax collection. By ancient custom, once every 3 months, all who lived under the Airwood banner were to offer their due. Wheat, honey, silver, hides, sometimes livestock or horses. Even the reeve of the farthest hamlet knew. Delay or refusal meant more than a lighter purse. It could cost one's life. While buckets clanged and servants bustled below, the Lord dressed in silence. His garments were heavy and rich, furs, embroidery, leather. Every thread spoke of status, power, and wealth, but luxury did not soften him. On the contrary, it reminded him of his burden. Descending into the hall, he passed knights, guards, and courtiers, without pause or glance. All bowed their heads, yet he did not seek greetings. He knew well, fear is far more reliable than respect. Thus began another day at Airwood Castle, a day on which the subjects would once again be reminded who their master was, the day of tribute. With the first tolls of the inner courtyard bell, the day of tribute began. One by one and in groups, on carts and on foot, the Lord's subjects made their way to Airwood Castle. They brought offerings and taxes in sacks, crates, and baskets. Some bowed as they passed through the gates. Others crossed themselves, casting wary glances at the arrow slits, where armed guards stood watch. Inside the great hall, a tense silence reigned. Servants had already arranged long oak tables for tallying and recording the offerings. Wooden benches lined the walls for those awaiting their turn. The air was thick, like the stillness before a storm. At the dais beneath the family crest sat Lord Airwood. Flanked by squires and silent advisors, he surveyed the faces below. Some familiar, others new, but all beneath him. Weak, poor, dependent. Each entrant approached the tables and laid out what was owed. Sacks of grain, blocks of wax, barrels of wine, hides, honey, fish. Every item was recorded in leather-bound ledgers, counted, examined. Occasionally, a displeased shake of the head followed the inspection. Some brought less than required. Poor harvests, illness, or misfortune were offered as reasons. But excuses held little weight. Those who gave too little lingered longer in the shadows. They were remembered. They were at risk. Merchants, by contrast, brought more than expected. Chests of coins, rare fabrics, spices from distant lands. They understood that generosity was not weakness, it was investment. They were met without warmth, but without hostility. All day, faces changed, wheels creaked, doors groaned. Servants carried the offerings to the stores. Scribes noted sums, names, and debts. And over it all loomed the still figure of the Lord, cold, focused, incorruptible. By twilight, the last village had paid its share. The castle fell quiet once again. In its storerooms, wealth had piled high. and over it all stood the silent authority of the man whose will was law. Evening in the castle night slowly fell over Airwood. Outside the castle windows, darkness deepened. Light mists rose from the valleys, and torches along the walls ignited one by one. Inside, the fireplaces roared to life, crackling flames filling the halls with the scent of roasted meat, wine, and spices. Lord Airwood spent the remainder of the day in his study. On the wide table lay parchments, seals, and maps of his holdings. He studied reports, compared tax collections, and made notes with a firm hand. His face remained calm, but every stroke of the pen was a decision with consequences. Evenings in the castle were a time of intrigue. Servants, advisors, knights, and guests moved from room to room, exchanging glances, whispers, and worries. Lady Eleanor entertained a select few in her boudoir. Her conversations were gentle, yet marked by precision. She did not interfere in her husband's affairs, but knew far more than she revealed. Dinner in the great hall was attended only by the chosen few. Tables groaned under feasts of venison, roasted swans, cheeses, grapes, and wine from southern slopes. The Lord spoke little. He listened, not to words, but to pauses, intonations, and attempts to please. Amidst food and music, he sought out lies, fear, and weakness. In the distant corridors, maidservants hurriedly cleared the day's remnants. In the dungeons, the guard changed shifts. The sentries on the towers yawned, but knew the Lord tolerated no negligence. Every detail in the castle answered to one law, a strict order that kept this place firmly in iron bounds. When the clock struck midnight, Airwood retired to his chambers. The wind outside carried the scent of fires and damp earth. For a brief moment, he paused by the window. The land slept, but his rule over it remained awake. Secrets and conspiracies. After midnight, the castle fell into a deep silence, broken only by the occasional footsteps of the guards and whispered voices in the dark corridors. At this hour, secrets came alive. In one of the towers, in a small room with a low window, a group of men and women dressed in dark cloaks gathered. Their faces were hidden by hoods, but their eyes shone with determination. They were not servants or knights, but conspirators, those who had grown weary of tyranny and injustice. They discussed plans and ciphers, exchanged information about patrols and the Lord's schedule. Every word was soaked in fear, but also in hope. Hope for change that could come only in the night. Meanwhile, Lady Eleanor, in her chambers, wove her own intrigues. Her allies were influential and cunning, and she skillfully used their ambitions and fears. No one knew what cards she held up her sleeve, but everyone feared to cross her path. Deep within the castle, Lord Richard slept heavily, but his sleep was restless. Thoughts of discontent among his subjects, of treachery and betrayal, churned in his mind. He knew that power was not only the strength of the sword, but also a game of shadows. The night in Airwood was far from peaceful. Here, destinies were born, lives were decided, and with each passing hour, a new battle approached, not on the field, but within the fortress walls. Dawn of change morning once again wrapped the castle in fog, but this time the air was tense, filled with anticipation. Messengers hurried along narrow paths, spreading news and orders, while within the castle halls, a sense of impending events lingered. Lord Richard, upon waking, felt the weight of responsibility even more heavily. Each day was a test of power, the hopes and fears of his subjects like thin ice beneath his feet. He once again studied letters and reports, trying to anticipate the course of future events. Lady Eleanor, clad in nobility and coldness, prepared to receive important guests. Her smile was sharp as a blade, her glances hiding plans and secrets. On this day, the fate of the castle could turn in any direction. In the villages surrounding Airwood, people gathered in the squares, some in fear, others in hope. Rumors of conspiracy and discontent spread swiftly like wildfire. Servants and guards readied themselves for unforeseen happenings. The morning's silence was deceptive. Everything around was preparing for change, and none within the castle could predict how it would end. The fateful council. In the great hall of the castle, Lord Airwood's council gathered. Knights, elders, advisors, all those who could influence the course of events took their seats. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. Lord Richard listened carefully to reports from the edges of his lands. Rumors of discontent were growing, and rumors often became reality. His voice was steady, but each word carried the weight of responsibility and resolve. The council discussed possible measures, strengthening the guards, negotiating with the discontented, perhaps even harsh sanctions. Every participant understood that their decisions would determine not only the fate of the castle, but the lives of many. Lady Eleanor, present at the council, remained silent, observing reactions. Her thoughts were deeply hidden, but the influence she wielded was clear to all. After lengthy discussion, it was decided they must act swiftly and decisively. Servants began preparing orders, while knights and guards intensified patrols along the borders. The castle lived in anticipation, waiting for what the next day would bring. The storm over Airwood. The sky darkened with heavy clouds, and the wind howled, cutting through the castle walls like a piercing whistle. The day was tense, a harbinger of the approaching storm. News of the decisive measures spread quickly across the lands. In some villages, disputes flared. In others, the first acts of defiance appeared. Knights and guards stood ready for any turn of events. Lord Richard conducted an inspection of the garrison, checking their readiness for battle. His gaze was stern, and his body bore no weakness, despite the years. He knew that today, every action would determine the safety of his domains. Lady Eleanor, despite her outward calm, met with her allies. Their whispers and glances spoke of plans that could shift the balance of power. In the shadow of the castle, a struggle was raging. By evening, the sounds of troops gathering in first clashes echoed in the surroundings of Airwood. The castle prepared for a test, to see if it could withstand the assault and maintain the Lord's rule. The night of battle night plunged the castle into darkness, broken only by torchlight and the glint of blades. The air was thick with tension, as if the very darkness held its breath. Outside the walls, troops gathered, ready to storm. The conspirators and the discontented were resolute. Their faces reflected a mix of fear and desperation. Every step brought the inevitable clash closer. Inside the castle, Lord Richard focused on directing the defense. His orders were clear and uncompromising. Knights and guards took their positions, prepared to meet the enemy. Lady Eleanor watched from her chamber window, understanding that the outcome of this night would change many destinies. She knew the price of victory and defeat, and was ready for any result. With the first strikes of swords and cries, the battle began. Airwood became an arena of struggle, where honor, loyalty, and power intertwined in a deadly dance. The aftermath. The morning after the battle was heavy and grim. The castle and its surroundings bore the marks of conflict: broken gates, hoofprints, and bloodstains on the ground, scorched sections of walls. Lord Richard walked among the wounded and the dead. His face was composed, but weariness and pain were visible in his eyes. Power had come at a steep price. Lady Eleanor worked with healers and aides, organizing care for the injured and bolstering morale. Her cold resolve helped many endure. The Lord's Council gathered again, this time to discuss new challenges. The peace was fragile, and any mistakes could lead to further unrest. Despite the losses, Airwood stood. The Lord's power remained, but the cost was forever etched in the hearts of all who survived that night. A new order. Weeks had passed since the battle, and the castle began to heal. Wounds were closing, but the memory of events remained fresh in minds and hearts. Lord Richard strengthened his rule by implementing reforms aimed at reinforcing order and justice across his lands. He understood that fear was a poor counselor and sought to earn the loyalty of his subjects through both wisdom and strength. Lady Eleanor grew even more influential, using her power to solidify political alliances. Her sharp mind and cold composure aided the Lord in making difficult decisions. The people in the villages gradually calmed, though many knew change was inevitable. The new order in Airwood was built on a balance of power and wisdom, walking a fine line between fear and respect. The castle was once again a home to the Lord who understood the cost of power and was prepared to pay it every day. Legacy years passed, and Lord Richard grew older, but his resolve and wisdom only strengthened. His rule left a mark on the history of Airwood, a fortress that had withstood the tests of time and the storms of fate. Lady Eleanor continued to be his loyal advisor and ally, helping to build a future where power served not only itself, but also the people. The Lord's children grew, learning and preparing for their roles. They inherited not only lands and titles, but also the responsibility that comes with ruling the destinies of others. Airwood Castle became a symbol of strength, but also a lesson that power demands wisdom, patience, and readiness for sacrifice. The story of Lord Richard is the story of a man who accepted the burden of power and learned to bear it with honor. The eternal flame. Evening fell over Airwood, and torches were lit on the castle towers, symbols of life and continuity. The stories lived within these walls continued to burn in the hearts of those who came after. Lord Richard, sitting by the fireplace, watched the flames, seeing in them reflections of his victories and defeats. The power he bore was like this fire, demanding care, but able to light the way for many. Lady Eleanor stood nearby. Their eyes met, a silent acknowledgement of a complicated fate intertwined with their lives and the castle. Airwood Castle was not just stones and walls. It was a home, a legacy, and an eternal flame that would burn as long as there were those who believed in strength and honor. Shadows of the past. Despite the calm achieved after many trials, old enemies and unhealed wounds continued to lurk in the shadows of the castle. The past did not easily release those who had survived battles and intrigues. Lord Richard increasingly noticed shadows in the corridors, hints of secret meetings and whispers behind closed doors. Doubts and fears appeared even among his closest advisors. Lady Eleanor remained vigilant. She delved into old documents and rumors, seeking to uncover hidden threats and prepare new strategies. Meanwhile, the Lord's children, now young adults, faced challenges that seemed entirely different. The struggle for power within the family, political intrigues, and their first tests of leadership. Airwood Castle lived its own life, where past and present intertwined in an unending game of shadows. The heir's trials. Time passed, and Lord Richard's children began to take on more responsibilities. Each had their own character and vision for the future, which brought not only hope, but also friction. The eldest son, Sir Thomas, was a warrior, proud and straightforward. He believed in the power of the sword and honesty on the battlefield, but did not always understand the subtleties of politics. The youngest daughter, Lady Margaret, was clever and cunning, masterfully wielding words and intrigues, preparing to become an indispensable ally in the struggle for influence. The middle son, Sir Edward, sought balance, learning from his father and mother, trying to combine strength and wisdom. But he did not yet know if he could endure all trials. A new chapter began in the castle, a chapter where the Lord's heirs would prove their readiness for power and preserve the family legacy. The time of choice. On the eve of the great feast, the castle was filled with anticipation. Everyone knew that soon Lord Richard would announce who would become his heir and continue the family's legacy. The Lord's children understood that this trial was not only about strength and wisdom, but also about character. The fate of the family and lands depended on the right choice. Gathered in the hall, Lord Richard looked intently at each of them. He recalled the years of struggle, victories, and defeats that had shaped not only himself, but also his children. The Lord's voice was deep and resolute as he spoke his decision. But in that moment, not only the choice was fateful, it was the beginning of a new era, full of possibilities and challenges. A new era. The decision announced by Lord Richard stirred mixed emotions, joy, anxiety, and even hidden envy. But each heir understood that from now on, they must act in the interest of the family and their lands. Sir Thomas embraced his role as the chief defender of the lands, ready to protect them with sword and shield. His strength and courage became a stronghold for knights and common folk alike. Lady Margaret took on the task of strengthening political ties, negotiating with neighboring lords and nobility. Her sharp mind and eloquence secured advantageous alliances for the family. Sir Edward became an advisor and mediator, striving to maintain balance and peace within the castle and in relations with the outside world. Lord Richard watched their actions with pride and hope, knowing that Airwood's legacy was in reliable hands. Trials of power. Despite the apparent calm, new challenges did not take long to arrive. Hostile lords and ambitious claimants to lands sought weaknesses in Airwood. Sir Thomas led military campaigns, repelling attacks and defending the borders. His tactics and bravery earned respect even among enemies. Lady Margaret faced intrigues at the courts, where every step could turn into betrayal. She learned the arts of diplomacy and cunning to maintain the family's position. Sir Edward worked on strengthening internal order, resolving conflicts among vassals and preventing uprisings. Lord Richard watched them, understanding that trials of power are an eternal part of a lord's life. Only united could they preserve Airwood. Alliances and betrayals. The political game in the halls of power grew increasingly complex. New alliances with neighboring lords brought both benefits and dangers. Lady Margaret forged an important treaty with a powerful duke, but not everyone in the castle welcomed this move. Some advisors suspected hidden motives and prepared for possible betrayal. Sir Thomas kept the army ready, but he knew that the sword did not always solve every problem. The balance between force and diplomacy grew ever more delicate. Sir Edward sought to prevent internal conflicts, but suspicion and fear sometimes hindered unity. Lord Richard felt that many more trials lay ahead and understood that only wisdom and unity could preserve the House of Airwood. Dark times. Dark clouds loomed over Airwood. Rumors of a conspiracy among the closest vassals troubled Lord Richard. Loyalty began to waver, and fear and distrust crept into hearts. Sir Thomas struggled to maintain order on the borders, where enemies sought opportunities to strike. Lady Margaret, despite her successes, faced betrayal from within. Whispers and hidden foes threatened her reputation. Sir Edward tried to keep peace within the castle, but each day brought new trials and dangers. Lord Richard understood that to endure, they needed not only strength, but also wisdom and faith in each other. United in battle. When the conspiracy reached its peak, Lord Richard and his children realized that only together could they face the looming threat. Loyal warriors and advisors gathered in the heart of the castle. Sir Thomas led the defense of the fortress, preparing for the decisive battle. His experience and determination inspired the soldiers. Lady Margaret used her connections to expose the traitors and secure the support of allies. Sir Edward took on the role of negotiator, trying to ease tensions and find opportunities for peaceful resolution. United, Lord Richard's family stood against the storm, because only in unity could Airwood and its legacy be preserved. Victory and change. The battle was fierce and bloody, but thanks to the unity of the family and the determination of the warriors, Airwood withstood the enemy's assault. The traitors were neutralized and loyalty restored. Lord Richard understood that this victory was not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. Times were changing, and with them, the duties of a ruler. The sons and daughter became not just heirs, but true leaders, ready to guide their people into the future. New voices echoed through the castle, voices of hope, change, and peace. The legacy of Airwood. Lord Richard began to pass on his experience and knowledge to his children, understanding that True strength lies in wisdom and responsibility. He taught them not only to manage lands and armies, but also to care for the people living under the castle's protection. The children absorbed their father's lessons, preparing to bear the burden of power with honor and justice. Airwood Castle became a symbol not only of strength, but also of fair governance, leaving a legacy that would endure for centuries. The Lord's final years took their toll. Lord Richard ventured from his chambers less and less, handing over governance to his children. He watched as the castle changed, as his heirs strengthened their power and expanded their influence. In the Lord's heart was peace. He knew that family and land were in reliable hands. Before departing, he held a final council, giving guidance and reminding them of the values that should lead them forward. His passing was quiet but significant, the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. The legacy continues. After Lord Richard's death, Airwood became a symbol of strength and wisdom, passing the lessons of the past to new generations. The heirs continued to develop the castle, strengthening ties with neighboring lands and caring for their people. Stories of Lord Richard and his family were passed down from mouth to mouth, inspiring future rulers with honesty, courage, and unity. Thus, the life of the wealthy medieval lord became not just a tale of wealth and power, but an example of true leadership and legacy. A look to the future. The Airwood family stood on the threshold of new changes. The wisdom of their ancestors and the lessons of the past became the foundation for new achievements. The Lord's children, now grown and experienced, made plans for the future, striving to preserve and multiply wealth and influence. The castle continued to be the center of life and power, but now with special care for the common people and stability in the lands. Thus ended the story of one of the most powerful lords of his time. But a new one began, a story full of hope and possibilities. New horizons. The Airwood family expanded their holdings, opening new trade routes and strengthening ties with distant lands. Lords and merchants came to the castle, bringing news and goods from faraway countries, changing the familiar way of life. The Lord's children studied new sciences and arts, preparing for a complex world where knowledge became as important as the sword. Airwood became a symbol not only of medieval power, but also of progress, weaving new threads into its history. Time of peace. Over the years, peace and prosperity reigned in Airwood. The lands were fertile, the people content, and the castle shone with its power and beauty. The lords and their children engaged not only in politics and war, but also in arts, sciences, and construction. New schools, workshops, and libraries emerged, nurturing future generations. The Airwood family became an example of harmony between power and culture, showing that strength can go hand in hand with wisdom and kindness. Legacy forever. Century after century, Airwood Castle stood as a witness to history, preserving within its walls the memory of Lord Richard and his family. The Lord's descendants continued the traditions, passing knowledge and values from generation to generation. Stories about the life of the wealthy medieval lord inspired not only the local people, but also those who heard of Airwood's greatness far beyond its lands. Thus, the legend of the family and the castle became eternal, a symbol of strength, wisdom, and devotion. Returning to the roots. From time to time, Lord Richard's descendants returned to the old castle to remember the lessons of their ancestors and strengthen their bond with the land. They held celebrations, gathered stories, and revived traditions that helped preserve the family spirit. Every stone of Airwood held memories of past battles, victories, and trials, reminding them of the cost of power and responsibility. Thus, despite the changing eras, the connection to their roots remained strong and unbreakable. Eternal legacy. Airwood became not just a castle, but a symbol of eternal legacy, of strength, wisdom, and devotion. Stories of Lord Richard and his family were told to children and grandchildren, inspiring them to walk the path of honor and justice. Though centuries pass, the spirit of Airwood and its lessons will remain forever in the hearts of those who cherish the past and build the future. Thus concludes the tale of the life of a wealthy medieval lord, a great ruler and father of his land. Why the story ends. The life of Lord Richard and his family is a tale of the rise and strengthening of the House of Airwood. The story ends at the moment when the Lord passes the reins of power to his children and steps into the shadows, a natural stage in the life of every ruler. Such an ending emphasizes that true leadership is not in the eternal rule of one person, but in wise inheritance and the continuation of the cause by future generations. Lord Richard's story is not just a chronicle of events, but a symbol of how strength, wisdom, and unity help overcome difficulties and preserve a legacy. The conclusion of the narrative is the beginning of a new path carried on by descendants, while the Lord remains in memory as the founder of a great house. The heir's trials. After Lord Richard's departure, the heavy burden of governing Airwood fell upon his children. Each faced new challenges, internal intrigues, changes in the kingdom's politics, and threats from neighboring lands. The eldest son, Sir Thomas, proved himself a wise strategist, defending the borders and strengthening the defenses. Lady Margaret took up diplomacy, striving to maintain peace and strengthen alliances. Sir Edward taught the people new crafts and knowledge, helping to improve the lives of the common folk. The heirs understood that power is not just a privilege, but a great responsibility that demands unity and wisdom. Family unity. Understanding that only together could they preserve and multiply the legacy of Airwood, Lord Richard's children united. They held joint councils, discussed strategies, and supported each other during difficult times. Family bonds grew stronger every day, and trust and mutual help helped them overcome any trials. Airwood regained its strength, not only in stone and swords, but in unity and devotion to their family and land. Shadows of the past. Despite their internal unity, the Airwood family could not fully escape the shadows of the past. Old enemies remained vigilant, and intrigues at the royal court still threatened the peace of their lands. The eldest son, Sir Thomas, received troubling reports from spies. Plots were being woven in the shadows of the castle walls, and enemies sought weaknesses. Lady Margaret, possessing a sharp mind and diplomatic skill, began secret negotiations with allies to protect the family and land from external threats. Sir Edward, observing the common folk, understood that the support of the people was another shield against enemies. He organized aid and taught crafts, strengthening trust and loyalty. Evenings in the castle were often spent by candlelight, where the lords gathered in the great hall, sharing news and making plans for the future, understanding that peace was not only a gift, but also a battlefield in the shadows. Threats from beyond spring brought not only the renewal of nature, but also the first signs of an approaching danger. Along the borders of Airwood, bands of mercenaries began to appear. Unknown, well-armed, avoiding open battles but leaving behind scorched villages and fear. Sir Thomas immediately reinforced the garrisons, sending scouts to the most threatened regions. He sensed this was only the beginning. Someone's shadow had once again fallen over the ancestral lands. Lady Margaret set out to discover who was behind the attacks. Through her network of trusted envoys and informants, she traced the threat to a northern baron who had been exiled years ago for treason. It seemed he had been gathering forces in exile, dreaming of reclaiming power and taking revenge on the Airwood family. Meanwhile, Sir Edward focused on organizing defense among the common folk. He trained village elders, created secret signaling systems, so that in times of danger, every villager would know where to go and what to do. Dark clouds gathered over Airwood, but Lord Richard's family was no longer what it once had been. They were united not only by blood, but by a shared past that had taught them how to fight and how to win. The ghost of war summer began with unease. Enemy banners appeared on the horizon. The exiled baron, having gathered under his command cutthroats, dispossessed knights, and vengeful mercenaries, advanced toward the borders of Airwood. Sir Thomas, faithful to his father's teachings, did not rush into battle. He fortified the walls, posted sentries in the forests, and sent messengers to old allies, those who once fought beside Lord Richard. Margaret led delicate negotiations, navigating between the interests of the crown and neighboring lords, persuading them of the need for unity in the face of a common threat. Thanks to her diplomacy, Allied forces began arriving at Airwood, small in number but seasoned and loyal. Sir Edward took charge of supplies. He organized the provision of food, gathered weapons from across the region, and even worked in the forge alongside local blacksmiths. He was respected not just for his name, but for his labor. The people prepared for siege. Even teenagers were trained in the castle. Those who couldn't hold a sword crafted arrows, treated the wounded, and cooked for the defenders. This was not just a fight for land. It was a fight for home, for memory, and for the name of Airwood. The first blows. The enemy struck without warning, beneath the cover of morning mist. While the songs of larks still echoed in the fields, the army of the exiled baron approached the western border and fell upon one of the watchtowers. Sir Thomas, hearing the urgent ringing of the bells, immediately led a cavalry unit to the site. The battle was brutal. The walls were assaulted with battering rams, ladders were raised to the parapets, but the defenders held their ground. At the height of the assault, when the enemy breached the tower's inner walls, Thomas himself climbed to the upper levels and, sword in hand, led his men in a counterattack. His bravery inspired the soldiers, and by midday, the tower had been reclaimed. Back at the castle, Lady Margaret organized the treatment of the wounded, personally assisting the healers and issuing orders calmly and precisely, just as her father had once done. Sir Edward arrived at the tower with a supply convoy and fresh reinforcements. His foresight saved the garrison from exhaustion. But this was only the beginning. Scouts reported that the enemy's main force had yet to arrive. What seemed like a battle had merely been a trial strike. The storm approaches. The days grew shorter, and heavy clouds stretched across the plains. At last, the main enemy force appeared on the horizon. Dozens of banners fluttered in the wind, and thousands of feet trampled the earth. The army of the exiled baron had reached Airwood. Inside the castle, a focused silence reigned. There was no panic, no chaos, only measured preparation. Sir Thomas personally inspected the walls, checking the fortifications and speaking with the commanders of each post. Lady Margaret held final talks with allied forces. Among them were old comrades of Lord Richard and new barons who had come in the name of honor. All were ready to fight to the end. Sir Edward gathered all supplies in the castle, counted every sword, every bow, every arrow. He visited the villages, inspiring the people. In the eyes of the peasants, there was no fear, only resolve. Airwood became a symbol not only of medieval power, but also of progress, weaving new threads into its history. Time of peace. Over the years, peace and prosperity reigned in Airwood. The lands were fertile, the people content, and the castle shone with its power and beauty. The lords and their children engaged not only in politics and war, but also in arts, sciences, and construction. New schools, workshops, and libraries emerged, nurturing future generations. The Airwood family became an example of harmony between power and culture, showing that strength can go hand in hand with wisdom and kindness. Legacy forever. Century after century, Airwood Castle stood as a witness to history, preserving within its walls the memory of Lord Richard and his family. The Lord's descendants continued the traditions, passing knowledge and values from generation to generation. Stories about the life of the wealthy medieval lord inspired not only the local people, but also those who heard of Airwood's greatness far beyond its lands. Thus, the legend of the family and the castle became eternal, a symbol of strength, wisdom, and devotion. Returning to the roots. From time to time, Lord Richard's descendants returned to the old castle to remember the lessons of their ancestors and strengthen their bond with the land. They held celebrations, gathered stories, and revived traditions that helped preserve the family spirit. Every stone of Airwood held memories of past battles, victories, and trials, reminding them of the cost of power and responsibility. Thus, despite the changing eras, the connection to their roots remained strong and unbreakable. Eternal legacy. Airwood became not just a castle, but a symbol of eternal legacy, of strength, wisdom, and devotion. Stories of Lord Richard and his family were told to children and grandchildren, inspiring them to walk the path of honor and justice. Though centuries pass, the spirit of Airwood and its lessons will remain forever in the hearts of those who cherish the past and build the future. Thus concludes the tale of the life of a wealthy medieval lord, a great ruler and father of his land. Why the story ends. The life of Lord Richard and his family is a tale of the rise and strengthening of the House of Airwood. The story ends at the moment when the Lord passes the reins of power to his children and steps into the shadows, a natural stage in the life of every ruler. Such an ending emphasizes that true leadership is not in the eternal rule of one person, but in wise inheritance and the continuation of the cause by future generations. Lord Richard's story is not just a chronicle of events, but a symbol of how strength, wisdom, and unity help overcome difficulties and preserve a legacy. The conclusion of the narrative is the beginning of a new path carried on by descendants, while the Lord remains in memory as the founder of a great house. The heir's trials. After Lord Richard's departure, the heavy burden of governing Airwood fell upon his children. Each faced new challenges, internal intrigues, changes in the kingdom's politics, and threats from neighboring lands. The eldest son, Sir Thomas, proved himself a wise strategist, defending the borders and strengthening the defenses. Lady Margaret took up diplomacy, striving to maintain peace and strengthen alliances. Sir Edward taught the people new crafts and knowledge, helping to improve the lives of the common folk. The heirs understood that power is not just a privilege, but a great responsibility that demands unity and wisdom. Family unity. Understanding that only together could they preserve and multiply the legacy of Airwood, Lord Richard's children united. They held joint councils, discussed strategies, and supported each other during difficult times. Family bonds grew stronger every day, and trust and mutual help helped them overcome any trials. Airwood regained its strength, not only in stone and swords, but in unity and devotion to their family and land. Shadows of the past. Despite their internal unity, the Airwood family could not fully escape the shadows of the past. Old enemies remained vigilant, and intrigues at the royal court still threatened the peace of their lands. The eldest son, Sir Thomas, received troubling reports from spies. Plots were being woven in the shadows of the castle walls, and enemies sought weaknesses. Lady Margaret, possessing a sharp mind and diplomatic skill, began secret negotiations with allies to protect the family and land from external threats. Sir Edward, observing the common folk, understood that the support of the people was another shield against enemies. He organized aid and taught crafts, strengthening trust and loyalty. Evenings in the castle were often spent by candlelight, where the lords gathered in the great hall, sharing news and making plans for the future, understanding that peace was not only a gift, but also a battlefield in the shadows. Threats from beyond spring brought not only the renewal of nature, but also the first signs of an approaching danger. Along the borders of Airwood, bands of mercenaries began to appear. Unknown, well-armed, avoiding open battles, but leaving behind scorched villages and fear. Sir Thomas immediately reinforced the garrisons, sending scouts to the most threatened regions. He sensed this was only the beginning. Someone's shadow had once again fallen over the ancestral lands. Lady Margaret set out to discover who was behind the attacks. Through her network of trusted envoys and informants, she traced the threat to a northern baron who had been exiled years ago for treason. It seemed he had been gathering forces in exile, dreaming of reclaiming power and taking revenge on the Airwood family. Meanwhile, Sir Edward focused on organizing defense among the common folk. He trained village elders, created secret signaling systems, so that in times of danger, every villager would know where to go and what to do. Dark clouds gathered over Airwood, but Lord Richard's family was no longer what it once had been. They were united not only by blood, but by a shared past that had taught them how to fight and how to win. The Ghost of War summer began with unease. Enemy banners appeared on the horizon. The exiled baron, having gathered under his command cutthroats, dispossessed knights and vengeful mercenaries, advanced toward the borders of Airwood. Sir Thomas, faithful to his father's teachings, did not rush into battle. He fortified the walls, posted sentries in the forests, and sent messengers to old allies, those who once fought beside Lord Richard. Margaret led delicate negotiations, navigating between the interests of the crown and neighboring lords, persuading them of the need for unity in the face of a common threat. Thanks to her diplomacy, Allied forces began arriving at Airwood, small in number but seasoned and loyal. Sir Edward took charge of supplies. He organized the provision of food, gathered weapons from across the region, and even worked in the forge alongside local blacksmiths. He was respected not just for his name, but for his labor. The people prepared for siege. Even teenagers were trained in the castle. Those who couldn't hold a sword crafted arrows, treated the wounded, and cooked for the defenders. This was not just a fight for land. It was a fight for home, for memory, and for the name of Airwood. The first blows. The enemy struck without warning. Beneath the cover of morning mist, while the songs of larks still echoed in the fields, the army of the exiled baron approached the western border and fell upon one of the watchtowers. Sir Thomas, hearing the urgent ringing of the bells, immediately led a cavalry unit to the site. The battle was brutal. The walls were assaulted with battering rams, ladders were raised to the parapets, but the defenders held their ground. At the height of the assault, when the enemy breached the tower's inner walls, Thomas himself climbed to the upper levels and, sword in hand, led his men in a counterattack. His bravery inspired the soldiers, and by midday, the tower had been reclaimed. Back at the castle, Lady Margaret organized the treatment of the wounded, personally assisting the healers, and issuing orders calmly and precisely, just as her father had once done. Sir Edward arrived at the tower with a supply convoy and fresh reinforcements. His foresight saved the garrison from exhaustion. But this was only the beginning. Scouts reported that the enemy's main force had yet to arrive. What seemed like a battle had merely been a trial strike. The storm approaches. The days grew shorter and heavy clouds stretched across the plains. At last, the main enemy force appeared on the horizon. Dozens of banners fluttered in the wind, and thousands of feet trampled the earth. The army of the exiled baron had reached Airwood. Inside the castle, a focused silence reigned. There was no panic, no chaos, only measured preparation. Sir Thomas personally inspected the walls. checking the fortifications and speaking with the commanders of each post. Lady Margaret held final talks with allied forces. Among them were old comrades of Lord Richard and new barons who had come in the name of honor. All were ready to fight to the end. Sir Edward gathered all supplies in the castle, counted every sword, every bow, every arrow. He visited the villages, inspiring the people. In the eyes of the peasants, there was no fear, only resolve. That night before the battle, Lord Richard's children gathered in the old hall by the hearth, where their father had once sat. They said nothing, remembering his words, his gaze, his strength. Tomorrow they would prove that the name Airwood was not just a symbol, but an unbreakable wall against any enemy. The great battle at the walls of Airwood Dawn began in silence. Fog clung to the plains, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Then came the roar of horns, the clash of steel, the cries of captains. War had arrived. The exiled baron's army advanced toward the castle. In its ranks marched not just soldiers, but bitter men driven by a thirst for destruction. They brought siege towers, ballistae, and blazing torches. Sir Thomas stood atop the main tower, watching the enemy's movements. He had no doubt. The enemy was strong, but the walls of Airwood and the hearts of its defenders were stronger. When the assault began, he descended to the front lines and led the first wave of defense himself. Sir Edward, clad in leather armor, commanded the eastern wall. He fought side by side with common soldiers, instilling them with courage and resilience. His warhammer rang out among the chaos like a bell of defiance. Lady Margaret, from the upper towers, coordinated the actions of the Allied troops. Her cold mind and precise orders helped hold the lines and prevented flanking breakthroughs. The battle raged all day. The earth ran red with blood. The castle walls were scorched and cracked. But not a single enemy banner touched the towers of Airwood. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the exiled baron's army began to retreat. His forces were shaken, not only by the strength of the fortifications, but by the unyielding will of those who defended them. Aftermath of the battle. After a long and bloody day, the castle experienced a calm. The wounded were treated, the dead were buried, and the walls were being repaired. Lord Richard and his family gathered in the great hall to discuss their next plans. Sir Thomas, though tired, was full of determination. He understood that the enemy would not retreat for long and would prepare for another attack. His gaze was firm and confident. Lady Margaret proposed strengthening ties with neighboring lands and expanding the intelligence network. She emphasized the importance of diplomacy and information in this prolonged war. Sir Edward reported on the state of supplies and suggested setting up weapon and ammunition production within the castle to reduce dependence on external sources. Lord Richard listened to his children, seeing in them the strength and hope of their lineage. He knew the battle was not over, but with such a family, their home would stand strong. New trials. Several weeks had passed since the first battle, and life in the castle was gradually returning to normal, but the threat still loomed over Airwood. News of the victory spread across neighboring lands, attracting new allies, but also provocateurs. Some barons began plotting, seeing the war as an opportunity to expand their influence. Sir Thomas continued training the troops and strengthening the defenses. He didn't allow himself a moment's rest, knowing the enemy could return at any time. Lady Margaret held a series of meetings with diplomats, striving to maintain the fragile peace and secure resources for the castle. Her ability to see further than others saved Airwood from many dangers. Sir Edward focused on improving supplies and tried to introduce new technologies in the smithy to give their warriors an advantage. Lord Richard's family knew new trials awaited them ahead, but together they could weather any storm. Conspiracy in the shadows. The nights grew restless. Strange events began occurring within the castle. Important documents disappeared, weapons went missing, and secret whispers echoed through the corridors. Sir Thomas noticed the tension among the guards and ordered a covert investigation. His suspicions fell upon certain courtiers who might have their own interests and desires to weaken Lord Richard's family's power. Lady Margaret, using her diplomatic connections, began seeking possible allies among influential courtiers and neighboring barons to secure the castle from within. Sir Edward worked tirelessly to strengthen the defenses, knowing the enemy might use not only force but also cunning. Lord Richard understood that war on one's own side is not always fought with the sword. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy hides in the shadows, and to win, one must be prepared for anything. Secrets and betrayals. With each passing day, the air inside the castle grew heavier. Doubts and fears slowly seeped into people's hearts, for not only an external threat loomed over them, but also an internal darkness was undermining their strength. Sir Thomas, though a steadfast warrior, was now often lost in thought. He understood that mere courage and bravery would no longer save them from treachery. Nightly patrols and secret meetings forced him to sharpen all his senses, trying to uncover the traitor. Lady Margaret organized a network of informants and spies, using her connections among courtiers and peasants alike. She often mingled among common folk, listening to their stories, gathering fragments of truth. Soon, she discovered that the conspirators were driven not only by thirst for power, but also by an ancient feud reaching far into the past. Sir Edward, despite his weariness from constant battles and guard duty, found the strength to renew the smithy and craft new kinds of weapons. He knew that if the traitors found a way to weaken the castle from within, only superior arms could help them stand in the coming battle. Meanwhile, Lord Richard gathered the council of elders and warriors, striving to unite both foes and allies, for without unity, they could not endure. His speech was strong and convincing, speaking of honor, family, and duty, urging everyone to become pillars of hope and strength. Through the shadows of the castle crept secret footsteps, and the fight for loyalty was no less fierce than battles on the field. But Lord Richard knew, only by dealing with the enemy inside could they stand against enemies outside. Fire in the night covered the castle with a dark veil, but there was no peace. In one corner of the courtyard, a fire erupted, a signal of alarm. The guards immediately sprang into action. Cries and the clashing of metal filled the air. It was a sudden raid by traitors. They attempted to set fire to the supplies and weapon stores to weaken the castle's defenses before the enemy's next assault. But the guard reacted swiftly. Lady Margaret personally directed the defense within the castle, organizing soldiers and distributing resources. Sir Thomas and his squad rushed into the flames, trying to extinguish the fire and hold off the attackers. The fighters battled with fierce desperation. Every second could be decisive. In one dark corridor, Sir Edward confronted a group of saboteurs in a ruthless and brutal fight. Meanwhile, Lord Richard gathered the remaining warriors to prepare for the coming siege. He understood that the traitors inside the castle had become a serious threat, and this night could be a turning point. When the fire was extinguished and the enemies driven back, a heavy silence fell. But everyone knew this was only the beginning of new trials. The castle had endured, but the wounds were deep. Unity for the future. After the dreadful night of fire and sabotage, the castle was on the verge of exhaustion. Many warriors were wounded, supplies dwindled, and the fighting spirit began to falter. Lord Richard understood. Endurance required more than weapons and walls. He summoned a council of representatives from all neighboring lands, including those who had previously wavered in loyalty or even openly opposed him. Lord Richard spoke honestly and openly. War was not only a fight against an external enemy, but also a trial for the very heart of their community. Lady Margaret played a key role in the negotiations, demonstrating the wisdom and cunning needed to ease tensions and awaken a desire for alliance. Sir Thomas led the training of the combined army, teaching knights and infantry new tactics based on the recent battles and internal betrayals. Sir Edward took charge of restoring infrastructure, smithies, barns, and workshops to speed up production and supply the army with everything needed. Gradually, distrust gave way to understanding, and the divided forces began to unite. Lord Richard saw before him not just allies, but a future worth fighting for, shadows of the past. Despite efforts to unite, old wounds and grudges continued to haunt them. Secret letters and hints of betrayal began to appear within the castle, coming from the most unexpected sources. Lord Richard understood that, over many years, too many unresolved conflicts had built up between families and clans. Some saw him as a threat, others as an opportunity for their own gain. Sir Thomas and Lady Margaret worked together to uncover hidden intrigues, untangle the web of lies, and find the truth. They had to face dangerous rivals who spared no deceit or force. Meanwhile, Sir Edward was perfecting new types of weapons, preparing for a possible war not only on the battlefield, but also within the rear. In his nightly reflections, Lord Richard often returned to thoughts of the past, that the true strength of the family and castle lay not in walls and swords, but in trust and loyalty, which must be preserved at any cost. Storm over Airwood. The day everyone feared had arrived. An enemy army, vastly outnumbering Lord Richard's forces, approached the castle. The wind drove clouds across the sky, as if foretelling the coming storm. Lord Richard gathered all the warriors for a final readiness check. His voice was firm and confident despite inner turmoil. He spoke of defending their homeland, of honor and duty to family and people. Sir Thomas took charge of troop deployment, organizing the defense at key points of the castle. Lady Margaret encouraged the women and children, helping prepare them for possible evacuation or shelter in safe places. Sir Edward handed out the newest swords and bows to the archers, hoping the technology would help offset the enemy's numerical advantage. When the first enemy units appeared on the horizon, Airwood Castle shone with fighting spirit and readiness for battle. Facing the approaching storm, everyone was ready to give everything to protect their home. The Battle of Airwood. The early morning greeted the castle with the thunder of the advancing army. The drums beat and enemy war cries echoed through the valleys. Lord Richard's warriors took their positions, preparing for the inevitable clash. The battle began with the siege of the walls. Edward's archers fired accurately, holding back the first waves of attackers. Meanwhile, Sir Thomas commanded the cavalry, aiming to break through the enemy's flank. Lady Margaret did not leave the war tent. Her role was not only diplomatic, but also to support the soldiers' morale. She personally visited the wounded, inspiring them to continue the fight. The battle lasted for hours, shifting from swift clashes to prolonged hand-to-hand combat. Every inch of ground was won at a heavy cost, but the defenders' resilience and unity prevented the enemy from breaking through. Lord Richard watched the battle from the high tower, his heart filled with pride for his people and determination to defend their homeland at any cost. Aftermath of the battle. After a long and bloody battle, Airwood Castle had held, but the cost was high. Many warriors had fallen, and those remaining were exhausted and wounded. Lord Richard walked among his people, expressing gratitude for their steadfastness and sacrifice. Lady Margaret organized care for the wounded and supported the families of the fallen to preserve the spirit and unity of the community. She knew physical wounds would heal, but the spiritual strength of the people was equally important. Sir Thomas led the restoration of defensive fortifications, understanding the enemy could return at any moment. His experience and determination inspired soldiers and craftsmen alike. Sir Edward focused on repairing weapons and creating new devices to improve their chances in future battles. Lord Richard realized that victory was only a temporary relief, and many trials still lay ahead. But unity and faith in the future gave strength to move forward. The delicate balance of peace. After the bloody battle, silence fell, but the calm was fragile and short-lived. Lord Richard knew the war had left deep scars, not only on the land and walls, but in the hearts of the people. The war changed everyone. Even the strongest knights felt weary, and the simple peasants lost hope for a peaceful future. Meetings were held in the castle to discuss how to prevent new conflicts and how to rebuild what was destroyed. Lady Margaret took responsibility for internal politics. She skillfully navigated between the interests of various factions, striving to maintain the fragile balance. She understood that only a united front could preserve peace and protect the castle from further troubles. Sir Thomas continued strengthening the army, introducing new trainings and tactics, preparing warriors for any surprises. He often said that the Lord's strength lies in his people, and the people must be ready to defend. Sir Edward experimented with new technologies and inventions, striving to equip the castle with modern weapons that could change the course of future battles. In these days, Lord Richard pondered much about the meaning of power and responsibility. He understood that true strength was not in swords and castles, but in the trust and loyalty of those around him. His main task became not just holding power, but creating a stable and just world for all subjects. While the castle recovered after the war, the Lord and his council prepared for new trials, knowing that peace is not a state, but a continuous struggle and effort. New horizons. Several months after the battle, Airwood Castle began to revive. The damaged walls were being repaired, fields and workshops restored, and trade with neighboring lands came back to life. Lord Richard, together with his advisors, developed plans to expand influence and strengthen economic power. Lady Margaret led educational projects, inviting scholars and craftsmen from distant lands to teach young nobles and artisans new knowledge and skills. She believed that progress and education were the keys to a sustainable future. Sir Thomas organized regular drills and maneuvers, cultivating not only fighting endurance, but also tactical thinking. He also developed an intelligence system to stay always one step ahead of potential enemies. Sir Edward continued improving the arsenal, experimenting with new mechanisms and weapons. His inventions became a source of pride and an important asset in negotiations with allies. During this time, Lord Richard established diplomatic relations, sending envoys to neighboring kingdoms and forming alliances that could bring peace and prosperity. The future of the castle seemed bright, but the Lord knew each new day brings new challenges, and only wisdom, unity, and strength of spirit would help preserve what had been achieved. The challenges of peace. The peace that had seemed so desirable after the war turned out to be no less of a trial than the battle itself. With the restoration of the lands, the growth of trade, and the strengthening of influence, Lord Richard now faced new difficulties, different in form, but no less dangerous. Among the nobility, ambitions began to surface. Some vassals, sensing a decline in external threats, began to discuss divisions of power, demands for autonomy, and even political alliances outside Airwood. Richard understood that an internal threat could be far more insidious than open war. At one of the great councils in the castle hall, he delivered a speech, reminding all of the price paid for the current order. He spoke not of power, but of duty to the people, and of the fragility of balance that had been achieved through blood. Meanwhile, disputes began to arise in the villages between settlers and native residents. Some believed they were more deserving of land. Others demanded equality. Lady Margaret initiated a series of public gatherings where residents could openly discuss problems. Her ability to listen and seek compromise strengthened trust in the castle's rule. Sir Thomas, observing the growing unrest, reinforced garrisons in key regions, but did so cautiously, without a show of force. He knew that the goal now was not to intimidate, but to protect peace. Sir Edward began working on a system of communication and alerts between villages, using signal towers and flags, so that in the event of any threat, external or internal, the castle could respond quickly. And Lord Richard increasingly contemplated the future of his legacy. He understood that to rule meant not just to hold power, but to pass on order to those who would come after. He began gathering around him young, talented individuals, wards trained not in loyalty to the crown, but in service to justice and to the people. Peace turned out to be a complex chess game. But Richard, who had endured war and loss, did not fear challenges. He knew that the future of not just Airwood, but all the lands under his banner was at stake. Shadows of old enemies. While Airwood was undergoing a political and cultural revival, a new threat was awakening in distant lands. Along the borders, merchants and messengers began to disappear. Some villages reported sightings of mysterious riders who appeared at dusk, cloaked in black, bearing no banners, and speaking no words. They did not engage in battle, but their presence stirred unease. Sir Thomas dispatched scouts, and soon the truth became clear. In the north, forces were once again gathering under the banners of old enemies, those once defeated but not broken. Among them was Lord Maynhard, a former ally of the crown, exiled for treason. He had hidden away, gathering strength, forging alliances with marauders, mercenaries, and clans long hostile to Airwood. Lord Richard received the news with cold resolve. He did not raise alarm, unwilling to spread panic. Instead, he began a quiet mobilization. Under the guise of construction projects, border outposts were reinforced, knights trained in secret woodland camps, and merchants carried false rumors to mislead the enemy. Lady Margaret, meanwhile, corresponded with noblewomen of other castles, forming a discreet alliance, a diplomatic network of women capable of influencing decisions and extinguishing sparks of conflict before they could blaze into war. Sir Edward began designing a new type of signal tower, capable not only of using flags, but also mirrors and fire to communicate across vast distances. For the first time in Airwood's history, a rapid response network was being built. The tension mounted, but Lord Richard knew. As long as the enemy lurked in the shadows, he held the advantage. His task was to draw the threat into the light and crush it before it gathered the strength to strike. Yet deep in his soul, Richard sensed that the coming storm would be unlike any before, more cunning, more treacherous, and perhaps not every ally would withstand its temptations. A test of loyalty. As winter approached, it wasn't just the clouds that gathered over Airwood, but suspicions as well. Rumors of Maynhard's resurging army had reached the royal court, and some advisors began whispering that Lord Richard lacked the strength to eliminate the threat, that he held his lands by mere luck and diplomacy. Richard knew rumors were more dangerous than arrows. Though he outwardly maintained calm, he could feel the patience of those who once saw him as a pillar of strength starting to wane. His position grew precarious. One misstep, and even his allies might turn away. He knew then it was time to act. A secret council was summoned at night in the underground chamber of Airwood. At the table sat only his most trusted, Sir Thomas, Sir Edward, Lady Margaret, and young Elias, the son of a fallen knight whom Richard had raised as his own. There, he revealed his plan: to strike first at one of Maynhard's fortified outposts, silently, without a declaration of war, to sever the conspirators' growing network before it could tighten. It was a risky decision. It could provoke open conflict or earn the king's wrath. But doing nothing meant losing influence, and possibly everything they had built. Sir Thomas volunteered to lead the raid. With the best warriors, he moved northward through snowstorms and fog. Meanwhile, Lord Richard sent a secret letter to the king through a trusted courier. Not an excuse, but a warning. The threat was real, and Richard would take full responsibility to protect the crown. That same night, Lady Margaret intercepted a message sent by one of the lords to Maynard's camp. It contained a chilling truth. Betrayal had already crept inside the walls of Airwood. Someone close, someone trusted, was ready to switch sides. The test of loyalty had begun. And now, the enemy might not just wear another banner, but sit at the same table. Raid in the northern mist. Sir Thomas led the unit across lands locked in ice, where winter winds howled with fury and the nights were black as sin. 20 hand-picked warriors, all hardened in previous battles, followed him in silence like shadows. Their task was clear: infiltrate one of Maynard's fortified outposts and destroy its garrison before any message could be sent. They traveled forest paths, avoiding roads. Loyal local hunters had warned them of enemy patrols and potential ambushes. Every tree could conceal a bowman. Every rock might hide hostile eyes. The tension thickened with every league. On the third night, as a storm howled over the mountain pass, they reached the base of the hill where the fort stood. It was smaller than expected, but well defended. Watchtowers, wooden palisades, a signal pyre ready to blaze. Yet Sir Thomas knew they had only one chance. He split the men into 3 groups. One set fire to the outer supply sheds, drawing the garrison's attention. The second infiltrated a rear breach revealed by a deserter. The third, the main force, struck head-on, once panic had taken hold within the walls. The battle was brief but brutal. Among the defenders were mercenaries, cruel but disorganized. When smoke choked the sky and the screaming ceased, the fort was theirs. Not a single messenger had escaped alive, but the victory came at a cost. 3 of the men were mortally wounded. 1 went missing in the chaos. Amid the ashes of the supply shed, Thomas found a map. Routes, camps, supply chains, proof that Maynard was preparing more than just scattered raids. He understood then. This was not the main force. This had only been a shadow, a test. The real strike was still to come. Lord of shadows beyond the northern cliffs, in the ancient castle of Kleinfeld, torches once again blazed in halls, long shrouded in darkness. It was here that Maynard, the exiled lord, had built his new nest. He was no longer the man Richard once knew. Not a noble, not an ally, but a man burned from within by betrayal, exile, and the bitterness of loss. He sat in the council chamber, surrounded by figures better called ghosts. The leader of the barbarian clans from the Eastern Ridge, a former captain of the Royal Guard exiled for a coup attempt, and an old sorceress from the Livendale swamps, once serving at court before being accused of witchcraft. Maynard gathered outcasts and the broken like a mosaic, forging them into a weapon of vengeance. Before him lay the very map stolen from the fallen courier of Airwood. It bore marks unknown even to Richard: hidden trails, secret depots, weaknesses in logistics. Someone within Richard's circle was passing information to the enemy. Betrayal was not just possible, it was already happening. Maynard rose. His voice was hoarse, but steel rang in it. Let them think they've bought time. But we are already inside. We are in their walls, in their hearts. Empires do not fall from outside. They crumble from within. At dawn, dozens of messengers carried orders to activate sleeper agents in allied castles, bribe captains, sow fear through arson and disappearances. His army was not the largest, but it was a web, and the web was already tightening. Meanwhile, Sir Thomas returned to Airwood with the captured map. Every step toward home was weighed down by troubling thoughts. Had they acted too late? Had they already lost the advantage? That same morning, within Airwood's walls, the guards discovered a body in the southern tower, lifeless, a dagger in his chest. It was a scribe with access to Lord Richard's private correspondence. On the floor nearby lay a quill dropped hastily, and tracks leading into the darkness of the underground corridors. Shadows beneath the castle. After the discovery of the scribe's body in the southern tower, a tense silence settled over Airwood. Lord Richard understood. Betrayal had penetrated deep, And this was no mere conspiracy, but a challenge thrown directly at him. He ordered all exits from the castle to be sealed, increased the guards, and assigned a personal investigation under the supervision of Sir Edward, his loyal knight and friend. Every room, every corridor, and every underground passage was thoroughly searched. But the dark tunnels held their secrets. No one could say how long enemy spies had been hiding within. Meanwhile, Lady Margaret gathered the closest advisors and decided to trace the chain of betrayal. Using secret reports and whispers, she began to identify possible conspirators. Among the suspects were not only minor courtiers, but also influential figures, former trusted aides of the Lord. Richard felt the crushing weight of responsibility clutching his heart. His decision was difficult. He could not afford to make a mistake in this matter. Every false accusation could cause a rift among his people and weaken Airwood's defenses. That same night, Sir Edward reported to the Lord about strange traces in the dungeons, bloodstains, ancient symbols, possibly marks of a secret society that no living soul dared speak of aloud. Richard understood. The war was already being fought not only on the surface but in the shadows, deep within the castle, where the most insidious intrigues unfolded away from prying eyes. Conspiracy in the dark days passed, and tension in Airwood grew with every hour. Lord Richard felt the thin thread of trust between him and his vassals begin to fray. His former allies became suspicious, and words once spoken with respect now carried a hint of hidden threat. Lady Margaret did not leave the council chamber, sorting through notes and reports gathered over recent weeks. She understood that to unravel the web of betrayal, she would have to delve into the darkest corners of the court and find out who was truly pulling the strings. Meanwhile, Sir Edward led the search in the dungeons. He ordered guards posted at every entrance to the catacombs and forbade anyone from descending without his knowledge. Yet, despite all precautions, strange occurrences did not cease. Whispers were heard in the night. Footsteps echoed in empty halls, and once a burnt amulet was found, resembling the symbols discovered near the scribe's body. During a closed meeting, Lord Richard decided to personally interrogate several suspects. Among them was an old advisor, long close to Maynard, and a young squire recently appointed to the Lord, but with a mysterious past. The interrogations were tense. The old advisor, his face lined with wrinkles and fatigue, remained silent or answered evasively, but anxiety flickered in his eyes. The young squire, in contrast, was bold and unruly, arousing suspicion among those present. Lord Richard knew that in this game, every move could be the last. Betrayal was not only in deeds, it had penetrated hearts and souls, turning men into shadows of themselves. Suddenly, in the dead of night, a cry rang out. The guards found a group of strangers at the castle gates. They were attempting to break in armed. A swift clash revealed it was no accident. The attackers knew the guard placements, and their goal was clear: to eliminate Lord Richard. This assault was a grim warning. The enemy was already near. To win, the Lord would have to become not only a warrior, but a master of intrigue to hold power and protect his people. The Game of Shadows. After the failed assassination attempt, Lord Richard became more cautious. His castle transformed into a fortress, where every door and window was guarded, and the dungeons became a maze of inspections and secret patrols. But the fight against the enemy on the surface was only part of the war. He had to dive into a world of intrigue, where words were sharper than swords, and trust was the rarest currency. Lady Margaret and Sir Edward organized a network of informants among peasants, merchants, and even the castle servants. Information became vital. Every slightest suspicion and rumor could save a life. Meanwhile, Maynard, in exile, was strengthening his position. His allies were growing in number, and rumors of his revival spread far beyond Kleinfeld. He used every means: blackmail, bribery, and even the magic of the old witch. In Airwood Castle, doubts and fears steadily grew. Some vassals began secretly negotiating with the enemy. hoping for a change of power and personal gain. Lord Richard understood that to stand firm, he needed not just an army, but allies whose loyalty was beyond doubt. He increasingly held private meetings, summoning each to the council hall, trying to read souls and understand motives. One night, a mysterious unsigned letter arrived at the castle. It contained a warning of an impending attack from those closest to him. This message forced the Lord to strengthen the guards and prepare for a new phase of the struggle, where every decision could be fateful. Flame of betrayal. Morning in Airwood began with troubling news. One of the closest vassals, Sir Harold, was found dead at his estate, and mysterious signs resembling the seals of ancient cults were painted on the walls. It was said that a secret society, long forgotten and pulled from the shadows of history, was behind it. Lord Richard received the news with anxiety. He understood that the war had already spread beyond the battlefield. It had penetrated the minds and hearts of those who once swore loyalty. Lady Margaret and Sir Edward began an investigation, trying to uncover who could be involved in this sinister affair. Among the suspects were not only minor nobles, but also influential figures at court, as well as mercenaries disguised as merchants and craftsmen. Meanwhile, in exile, Maynard prepared a new assault. He gathered an army of bandits, runaway peasants, and disgraced knights, promising them wealth and power if they helped overthrow the Lord of Airwood. Lord Richard's plans grew increasingly complex, and time was running out. Every morning brought new threats, from poisoned messages to arson in nearby villages. A shadow of doubt grew within his soul. Who among his closest had betrayed him? And at what cost could he preserve his honor and lands? In the evenings behind closed doors in the castle hall, not only military strategies were discussed, but secret plots woven from lies and fear. Lord Richard knew the battle for Airwood was only beginning, and to win, he would have to become not just a lord, but a legend. Threads of fate. Lord Richard felt the web of intrigue and betrayal tightening around him. Each new day brought fresh challenges, and it seemed even the closest people could turn into enemies. At this time, Lady Margaret became the Lord's chief advisor. Her intellect and prudence allowed her to see the hidden moves of their foes and anticipate their steps. Together with Sir Edward, they created a system of secret meetings and information exchange, where every detail mattered. One such meeting brought an unexpected confession. A young servant, trembling with fear, admitted he had seen suspicious figures near one of the castle's hidden doors at night. He spoke of whispers and plans, hinting at an imminent conspiracy. Lord Richard immediately ordered increased guards in that area and set a trap. Soon, a group of conspirators was caught, armed and preparing to attack the Lord. This victory was important, but only temporary. The Lord understood that the true enemies were still hidden deeper within the castle, and betrayal could come from the most unexpected places. In Richard's heart grew a resolve not only to protect his land, but to purge it of corruption, so that one day his name would become a symbol of justice and strength. The winds of change. After capturing the conspirators, Lord Richard felt a turning point had arrived. The wall of hostility and distrust around him did not weaken, but now he had at least some support. Evidence and confirmed threats. Airwood Castle was filled with tense bustle. Blacksmiths reinforced armor, archers trained on the range, and servants and guards doubled their watchfulness. Everyone sensed that a new battle was coming, not only on the field, but in the hearts of the people. Lady Margaret, despite all the tension, remained a model of calm and wisdom. She spent hours at her desk, reviewing scrolls and reports, carefully analyzing every detail. Her advice became decisive in the Lord's plans. Sir Edward, meanwhile, dealt not only with military matters, but also with intelligence. His men infiltrated neighboring villages, gathering information about the moods and movements of mercenaries who might support Maynard. Lord Richard also began spending more time among the common folk, visiting markets, talking with peasants and craftsmen, striving to strengthen their faith and show that he was not just the master of the lands, but a protector of their lives and well-being. It was during this time that he received an unexpected letter from an old friend who warned that another traitor lurked within the castle, more dangerous and cunning than all the others. This news forced the Lord to rethink his strategies and tighten internal security. The winds of change blew strong and relentless. Lord Richard understood that to keep his power and honor, he would have to face trials no one yet knew about. The legacy of Airwood weeks had passed. The conspiracies had been uncovered, and the names of the traitors were committed to the flames. But despite the victories, Lord Richard's heart knew no peace. He stood atop the Tower of Airwood, gazing into the distance where the mist blanketed the hills. Beyond them lay enemies, fates, and the future. The following morning, Maynard's army reached the borders. They were many, more than expected. But in Lord Richard's ranks stood not only soldiers, but common peasants, young squires, and women who now held bows instead of spindles. They weren't just defending the walls, they were protecting their home, their lives, and the truth. The battle raged for 2 days. On the first day, the enemy broke through the western defenses, and the defenders of Airwood fell back to the inner courtyard. Despite the exhaustion, Lord Richard never left the field. He led the charge himself, his sword stained with blood, his armor cracked and battered. On the second day, at dawn, when all seemed lost, the warriors of the northern villages arrived. Reinforcements sent secretly by Sir Edward struck from the flank, turning the tide. Maynard was slain, pierced by a spear thrown by the daughter of a humble hunter. When the sun rose above the battlefield, strewn with the fallen, silence fell. This was not just victory, it was deliverance. Lord Richard sank to his knees. He had survived. He had defended everything he loved, but he knew he had changed, and the cost of that victory would remain with him forever. In the months that followed, he rebuilt the villages, founded infirmaries, and opened schools for peasant children. Together with Lady Margaret, he created a council that included not only nobles, but also common folk. Airwood was no longer just a fortress. It had become a symbol of unity, honor, and will. And when the years finally caught up with him, and Richard passed his sword and lands to his son, warriors, elders, and even former enemies gathered in the Great Hall. All bowed their heads before the man who had become not just a lord, but a legend. And in the chronicles written by monks, his name was inscribed in gold. Richard, defender of Airwood, the one who did not falter when the walls shook, and who brought hope when all seemed lost